In the winter of 1867, something happened in Little Rock that 3 federal agents swore they'd take to their graves. Thanksgiving night, a Reconstruction-era mansion, a man named Luke. The official report called it a regrettable incident of post-war violence. But the sealed testimony tells a different story, one involving strength that defied medical explanation, a neck broken with surgical precision, and a disappearance so complete it was as if Luke had never existed at all. If stories like this matter to you, the ones they tried to erase, then stay with me. Because what happened to Luke on that November night wasn't just murder. It was something the government spent decades trying to bury. The Arkansas River Valley in 1867 was a place caught between worlds. The war had ended 2 years prior, but the old order hadn't died. It had simply changed clothes. Plantations became labor estates. Slaves became contract workers. And men who'd once owned human beings now employed them under terms that were slavery in everything but name. 8 miles north of Little Rock stood the Blackwood Estate, 2,400 acres of cotton and timber owned by Nathaniel Blackwood, a man who'd made his fortune during the war, supplying both sides with whatever they needed. Some called him a profiteer. Others called him a survivor. Blackwood called himself a businessman, and business, in his view, required order, control, and an understanding of human potential that most men lacked. Luke arrived at Blackwood Estate in the spring of 1866, part of a group of 47 freed slaves who'd signed labor contracts they couldn't read. The contracts promised wages, housing, and fair treatment. What they delivered was different, but Luke was different too. The foreman who processed Luke's arrival made a note in the estate ledger. Subject displays unusual physical development. Recommend observation. That single line would prove prophetic in ways no one could have imagined. Luke stood 6'4", but it wasn't his height that drew attention. It was the way he moved. Economical, precise, like every motion had been calculated for maximum efficiency. His hands were scarred with burns that formed patterns too regular to be accidental. And when he spoke, which wasn't often, his vocabulary suggested an education that shouldn't have been possible for a man with his background. Nathaniel Blackwood noticed all of this within the first week, and Blackwood was a man who noticed everything. See, Nathaniel Blackwood had spent the war years doing more than moving supplies. He'd been tangentially involved with something the government would later deny ever existed, an experimental program run out of Fort Smith that studied human performance under extreme conditions. Enhancement, they called it, though the word meant different things to different people. Nutrition protocols, physical conditioning, chemical supplementation, and in some cases, procedures that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics so far, they crossed into something darker. The program had officially ended in 1865, its records burned, its subjects scattered. But men like Blackwood knew better. Enhanced subjects didn't just disappear. They survived. They adapted. And sometimes they ended up working on estates in Arkansas under names that weren't their own. Blackwood began testing Luke within the first month. Nothing overt, just observations, small tasks that required unusual strength or endurance. Lifting loads that should require 3 men. Working through heat that sent others to shade. Moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. Luke passed every test without apparent effort. And that's when Blackwood knew. In his private study, Locked away from prying eyes, Blackwood kept files, correspondence with former military physicians, requisition orders for chemical compounds that had no agricultural purpose, and lists, names, physical descriptions, last known locations, of subjects from the Fort Smith program who'd never been officially accounted for. One name appeared with a notation. Subject L7, Enhanced Protocol, absconded, March 1865. Presumed deceased. The physical description matched Luke perfectly. Even the scar patterns on his hands, chemical burns from solutions used in the enhancement process. Blackwood had found what the government couldn't, and he intended to make use of it. Over the following months, Luke's work assignments changed. Blackwood moved him from field labor to special projects, tasks that required extraordinary physical capability. Breaking rocks for a new road, moving machinery that normally required block and tackle, demolishing old structures with nothing but a sledgehammer and his bare hands. Other workers noticed. They whispered about Luke's strength, about the way he never seemed to tire, about how the overseers treated him differently, with a mixture of fascination and fear that bordered on reverence. A woman named Sarah, who worked in the estate kitchen, became Luke's closest confidant during this time. She'd been at Blackwood Estate for 3 years, had survived the war and its aftermath through a combination of intelligence and invisibility. She knew how to read people, how to sense danger before it arrived. And she sensed something gathering around Luke like a storm. "They're watching you different," she told him one evening as they sat behind the workers' quarters. "Not like they watching the rest of us, like you're something they're studying." Luke was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know. You in some kind of trouble?" "Been in trouble since the day I was born," Luke replied. "Question is, whether it's the kind of trouble you can walk away from." Sarah studied his face in the fading light. "You thinking about leaving?" "Every day. But leaving ain't simple when they know what you are." "What are you?" Luke looked at his hands, those scarred, powerful hands that could bend metal and crush stone. "A mistake," he said finally. "Something that wasn't supposed to survive." But he did survive. That was the problem. Or maybe it was the point. By autumn of 1867, Blackwood's interest in Luke had evolved from curiosity to obsession. He'd begun documenting Luke's capabilities in detailed journals, measuring performance, testing limits. He'd also begun corresponding with others, former military contacts, private researchers, men who operated in the shadows between legitimate science and something far more troubling. One letter, dated October 12, 1867, laid out Blackwood's thinking with chilling clarity. Subject L displays all markers of successful enhancement: strength approximately 300% above baseline, recovery rate dramatically accelerated, cognitive function elevated. But more intriguing is his evident awareness and control. Previous subjects demonstrated instability, aggression, psychological deterioration. Subject L shows none of these symptoms. He may represent the only successful completion of the protocol. Recommend immediate intensive study before capabilities decline or subject absconds. Blackwood was planning something. The other workers felt it. Sarah felt it. And Luke felt it most of all. The week before Thanksgiving, 3 men arrived at Blackwood Estate. They came in an unmarked carriage, carried no identification, and spent 2 days in closed meetings with Blackwood. The house staff who served them meals reported that one was a physician, another some kind of military officer, and the third introduced himself only as an interested party from Washington. They watched Luke work from a distance, took notes, conferred in low voices. On the second day, the physician examined Luke under the pretense of a health inspection required for all workers. He measured reflexes, bone density, cardiovascular response. He took blood samples. And when Luke asked why all this was necessary, the physician simply smiled and said, "Routine procedures, my boy. Nothing to concern yourself with." But Luke was concerned. He'd been through examinations like this before, back in Fort Smith, back when he'd been Subject L7, back when they'd transformed him into something that wasn't quite human anymore. That night, Sarah found him sitting alone, staring at the burn scars on his palms. "They're planning something," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What are you going to do?" Luke was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know. Running means living the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Staying means becoming what they want me to be. A specimen, a curiosity, something to be studied and used. There's got to be another way. If there is, I haven't found it yet." Sarah sat beside him. "My grandmother used to say that sometimes the only way out of a trap is through it. Not around it, through it." Luke looked at her. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was, right up until the day they sold her south and I never saw her again. Sarah's voice was steady, but her eyes held old pain. She also said that some people are put on this earth to break things, not because they want to, but because some things need breaking. Those words would echo in Luke's mind for days to come. Thanksgiving arrived cold and gray. Blackwood had invited guests, the 3 mysterious visitors, plus several local dignitaries, Reconstruction officials, and businessmen looking to invest in Arkansas's future. It was to be a grand affair, a celebration of prosperity and progress in a region still scarred by war. The workers prepared food, set tables, polished silver. Luke was assigned to grounds work, clearing the approach to the mansion, ensuring everything looked perfect for the arriving guests. It was meant to keep him visible but occupied, close at hand but not inside, where conversations might be overheard. But Luke had been listening for weeks, not just with his ears. His enhancement had sharpened all his senses to preternatural levels. He could hear conversations through walls, detect footsteps from impossible distances, sense the presence of others before they rounded corners. It was a gift and a curse, this heightened awareness. It meant he knew exactly what was being planned. After dinner, Blackwood intended to demonstrate his discovery to the assembled guests. He'd set up the old carriage house as a testing facility. Weights, chains, measuring equipment. He was going to show them what Luke could do. And then he was going to sell him, not as a person or even a worker, but as proof of concept. Evidence that human enhancement was possible, repeatable, profitable. There were already buyers interested. A mining company in Colorado that wanted enhanced laborers for deep excavation. A railroad consortium looking to speed construction across difficult terrain. Even military representatives interested in reviving the enhancement program, this time with better protocols and tighter control. Luke would become a specimen again, the first of a new generation, patient zero in a system of exploitation that would make slavery look merciful by comparison. As the sun set and torches were lit across the estate, Luke made his decision. Sarah had been right. The only way out was through. Not around. Through. The guests finished their meal around 8 o'clock. Blackwood rose from the head of the table, wine-glass in hand, and announced that he had something remarkable to show them. Something that would change their understanding of human potential. The assembled dignitaries followed him out into the November cold, toward the carriage house where lights blazed and Luke waited. The building had been transformed. Blackwood had installed chains bolted to the walls, iron bars of increasing thickness, a series of weights ranging from 50 to 500 pounds. In the center of the room, Luke stood in simple work clothes, expressionless, waiting. "Gentlemen," Blackwood began, "what you are about to witness will seem impossible. I assure you it is not. It is the result of scientific advancement, procedures developed during the war that enhanced human capabilities beyond natural limits. The government officially discontinued these experiments, but they failed to account for all subjects. I have located one such individual and spent months documenting his abilities." He gestured toward Luke. "This man possesses strength and resilience that defy conventional explanation. He can work longer, lift heavier loads, and recover faster than any 10 normal men. He represents the future of labor, of military capacity, of human achievement itself." One of the guests, a senator from Tennessee, spoke up. "If what you say is true, Mr. Blackwood, why hasn't the government continued these programs?" "Fear," Blackwood replied. "Fear of the ethical implications, fear of public response, fear of what might happen if such capabilities fell into the wrong hands. But I ask you, is it ethical to abandon beneficial technology because of baseless concerns? Is it responsible to let valuable resources go to waste?" He turned to Luke. "Demonstrate for our guests, if you would. Begin with the iron bars." Luke looked at the assembled men. 23 faces, ranging from curious to skeptical to hungry. Men who saw him not as a person, but as a commodity, a tool, an investment opportunity. Men who would use him and others like him without a moment's hesitation or regret. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Estate, Luke smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "No," he said quietly. The room went silent. Blackwood's expression darkened. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no, Mr. Blackwood. I don't believe I'll be demonstrating anything tonight." "You'll do as you're told, or what?" Luke's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "You'll beat me, sell me, kill me. I've had all those things done to me already, back when I was Subject L7. Back when doctors and scientists and military men, just like you gentlemen, decided I wasn't human enough to have rights." He took a step forward. Several guests stepped back. "You want to know what the enhancement did? It made me stronger, yes, faster, more resilient. But it did something else too. It made me aware, made me understand exactly what had been done to me and why, made me realize that to people like you, I would never be more than a thing to be used." Blackwood's face flushed red. "You forget yourself. You are here on a contract. A contract I can't read, signed under coercion, enforced by violence. Call it what you want, Mr. Blackwood, but we both know what it really is." The physician who'd examined Luke spoke up. "Subject L7, you must understand." "I'm not Subject L7," Luke interrupted. That's what you called me when you were injecting chemicals into my blood and forcing me to run until I collapsed. My name is Luke. I'm a human being, and I'm done pretending otherwise." He looked at each man in turn. "You want a demonstration? Fine. I'll demonstrate what happens when you push a man too far." What happened next occurred so quickly that witnesses later disagreed on the exact sequence of events. Luke moved toward Blackwood with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. Blackwood raised his hands, whether in self-defense or command was unclear. And then Luke's hands were around Blackwood's neck, and there was a sound like a dry branch snapping, and Nathaniel Blackwood collapsed to the floor, dead. The entire confrontation lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Luke straightened, breathing normally, completely calm. He looked at the assembled guests, who stood frozen in shock and horror. "Gentlemen," he said in that same conversational tone, "I suggest you leave. Now." They left. They scrambled over each other, pushed and shoved, abandoned all pretense of dignity in their rush to escape. Within 30 seconds, the carriage house was empty except for Luke and Blackwood's body. Luke stood there for a moment, looking down at the man who'd planned to sell him. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a deep, weary resignation. He'd done what needed doing, and now he would pay the price. But he wouldn't make it easy for them. Sarah found him 10 minutes later. She'd watched the guests flee in panic, had seen the fear on their faces, and knew immediately what must have happened. She ran to the carriage house and stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. Blackwood's body, Luke standing calmly, the broken chains that hung unused on the walls. "Oh, Luke," she whispered, "I know. They'll kill you for this. Probably. But at least I'll die as myself, not as Subject L7. Sarah moved closer, her mind racing. "We can run. I know people, safe places. Running won't work. You know that. They'll hunt me forever, and anyone who helps me will be in danger. I won't do that to you or anyone else." "So you're just going to wait here for them?" Luke shook his head. "No. I'm going to do something better. I'm going to make sure this story gets told. Make sure people know what happened here, what they were planning, what's been done to people like me. Let them kill me if they want, but they won't be able to bury the truth." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded packet of papers, documents he'd stolen from Blackwood's study over the past months, requisition orders, correspondence with the military, lists of other enhanced subjects, evidence of a program that officially didn't exist. These need to get to someone who can use them, someone who'll make noise, cause trouble, force the truth into the open. Sarah took the papers with trembling hands. "Where do I take them?" "There's a newspaper man in Memphis. Samuel Clemens, calls himself Mark Twain. He's been writing about Reconstruction, corruption, things the government wants hidden. Find him. Give him these. Tell him everything." "And what will you do?" Luke looked toward the mansion, where lights blazed and voices shouted, and the sound of approaching horses echoed in the cold night air. "I'm going to buy you time." He kissed her forehead, a gentle gesture from hands that had just killed a man, and walked out into the darkness. What happened over the next 4 hours became legend, though much of it remains unverified. According to witnesses, Luke didn't run. He walked directly toward the mansion into the heart of Blackwood Estate, where militiamen and local law enforcement were gathering. When they tried to arrest him, he simply kept walking. When they tried to stop him with clubs and fists, he moved through them like they weren't there. It took 15 men to finally bring him down, and even then he wasn't subdued so much as he simply stopped resisting. "Enough," he said. "I'm not here to hurt anyone else. I just wanted you to see me, wanted you to have to look at what you've done." They chained him, heavy iron chains that should have immobilized anyone. Luke stood quietly, making no attempt to break them, though everyone present knew he could. The physician who'd examined him earlier approached cautiously, medical bag in hand. "Subject L7. "Luke," he corrected. "My name is Luke." The physician nodded, something like respect in his eyes. "Luke, then. What did you hope to accomplish here?" "Recognition," Luke replied. "I wanted you to see me as a person, not a specimen. I wanted you to understand that what you did, what all of you did, was wrong. And I wanted to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "You killed a man. Hard?" Sarah laughed. "Luke, I survived slavery, war, and Reconstruction in Arkansas. I think I can handle some snow." They settled in a small community near Sitka, a place where multiple cultures mixed and people asked fewer questions about your past. Luke worked as a logger and fisherman, jobs that made use of his strength without drawing the kind of attention that would lead to questions. Sarah opened a small school, teaching children who wouldn't otherwise have access to education. Over the years, they built a life. Not the life Luke might have had if he'd been born in different circumstances, but a good life nonetheless. They had children, 3 daughters who inherited some of their father's strength, but not his enhancements. Luke taught them to read and write and think, to question authority and fight injustice, to see themselves as fully human, regardless of what others might claim. News from the outside world arrived slowly in Alaska, but it arrived. Luke learned that other enhanced subjects had come forward, that some had found the program's relocation assistance helpful, while others had chosen to remain in hiding. He learned that the congressional hearings had resulted in some reforms, though not as many as advocates had hoped. He learned that Mark Twain had written a fictionalized version of his story, changed the names, altered some details, but kept the moral core intact. And he learned that Blackwood Estate had been sold and subdivided, its history largely forgotten, its carriage house torn down and replaced with something more modern and less haunted. Luke felt no guilt about Blackwood's death. He'd spent years examining his actions from every angle, and his conclusion remained consistent. It had been necessary. Not good, not justified in any absolute sense, but necessary given the circumstances. Sometimes the only way out is through. Sometimes things need breaking. He did think about the other enhanced subjects, particularly those who hadn't survived. Subject L1 through L14, whose names he'd never learned, whose graves were unmarked or non-existent. They'd been experiments too, test cases in a program that had valued data over humanity. They'd died so that the protocols could be refined, so that Luke could survive. That knowledge weighed on him. On quiet nights, when Sarah and the children were asleep, Luke would sit outside and look up at the northern lights. And he'd think about those 15 souls who'd paid the price for his survival. He couldn't bring them back, couldn't undo what had been done, but he could remember them he could make sure their sacrifice meant something. In 1885, 17 years after leaving Little Rock, Luke received an unexpected visitor. A young man from Washington, too well dressed for Alaska, too nervous for the work he claimed to be doing. He waited until Luke and Sarah were alone before revealing his real purpose. "Mr. Luke," he began, "I represent a committee investigating historical government programs. We're trying to verify certain claims about human enhancement experiments conducted during and after the war. We have your name in our files, along with a notation that you testified in closed session in 1868. Would you be willing to answer some questions?" Luke studied the young man. "Why now? It's been almost 20 years. Because enough time has passed that we can speak more freely, because some of the people involved have died, and others have decided they're willing to talk. And because there are rumors, unverified, but persistent, that the program didn't actually end, that there are still experiments being conducted, still subjects being created." Sarah's hand tightened on Luke's arm. They'd built a life far from all of this. They'd raised children who knew nothing of their father's past, who thought of him as just a strong man who worked hard and loved them. Digging up old history risked everything they'd created. But Luke thought of those 15 subjects, of the price they'd paid. "What do you need to know?" The young man's questions were detailed, specific. He knew about the Fort Smith program, about the enhancement protocols, about the subjects who'd died and those who'd survived. He knew about Blackwood and about Luke's trial. He had documentation that Luke had never seen, medical records, experimental logs, autopsy reports. "How did you survive when the others didn't?" the investigator asked. Luke shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe I was stronger to begin with. Maybe the dosages were different. Maybe I was just lucky. The doctors never told us anything. We were specimens to them, not people they owed explanations. But you do know about the enhancement's effects. The increased strength, enhanced senses, accelerated healing. Yes. Have those effects diminished over time?" Luke considered lying. But what was the point? No. If anything, they've become more refined, more controlled. In the beginning, right after enhancement, everything was overwhelming. I could hear conversations a mile away, could smell things that made me sick, could lift things without meaning to and break them. But over time, I learned control. Now it's just part of who I am. The investigator made notes. "And you've had children." Sarah stiffened. "Why does that matter?" "Because if enhancement effects can be inherited, that changes everything. It means the program's impact extends beyond the original subjects." "My daughters are normal," Luke said firmly. "Stronger than average, maybe, but nothing like me. Whatever the chemicals did to me, it didn't fully transfer to them." The investigator nodded, but Luke saw him make a note with a question mark. They would keep watching, Luke realized. Not just him, but his children, maybe his grandchildren. The government's interest in enhanced subjects didn't end with the original generation. After the investigator left, Sarah held Luke close. "I thought this was over," she said. "I thought we were done with this." "It's never really over," Luke replied. "We're just living in the spaces between their attention." But even as he said it, Luke knew that their relative peace couldn't last forever. The world was changing. Technology was advancing. And the temptation to enhance human capabilities, to create stronger, faster, more resilient people, would always exist. He was proof of concept. He was evidence that it could work. And as long as he lived, someone somewhere would be interested in him, studying him, trying to figure out how to replicate what had been done. In 1893, Luke returned to Little Rock for the first time in 25 years. He came alone, telling Sarah and the children he had business to attend to. The real reason was simpler. He wanted to see if anything remained of the place where his life had changed. Blackwood Estate was gone, subdivided into smaller farms. The mansion had burned in an unexplained fire in 1872. The carriage house, where he'd killed Nathaniel Blackwood, had been demolished and its materials repurposed. Nothing physical remained of that Thanksgiving night. But the story remained. Luke discovered this when he stopped at a tavern in Little Rock and overheard men talking about the Bone Breaker, a half-legend, half-cautionary tale about a superhuman slave who'd snapped his master's neck and gotten away with it. The details had been distorted over time. Some versions made Luke a giant. Others claimed he'd killed a dozen men. One particularly creative retelling suggested he'd had supernatural powers, that he'd been possessed by the spirit of a bear or a demon. Luke listened to these stories with a mixture of amusement and sadness. They'd turned his desperate act into mythology, stripped away the context and the pain, and left only the violence. Future generations would remember the Bone Breaker, but they wouldn't remember Subject L7, or the Fort Smith program, or the men who'd died so that the enhancement protocols could be perfected. History, he realized, had a way of simplifying things, of turning complex moral questions into simple narratives of good and evil, of forgetting the uncomfortable truths that didn't fit neat categories. Before leaving Little Rock, Luke visited the county courthouse. He wanted to see the trial records, to verify that his story had been documented somewhere in official form. The clerk was reluctant at first. These were old records. Most people didn't care about cases from 25 years prior. But Luke insisted, and eventually the clerk brought out dusty files from 1868. The trial transcript was there, complete and detailed. So were Judge Hayes's sentencing remarks, the ones that had set Luke free. But there was something else too, a sealed addendum, added years after the trial, marked, "Classified, do not open without federal authorization." "What's that?" Luke asked. The clerk shrugged. "Above my pay grade. Happens sometimes with old cases that had federal involvement. The government comes through later, seals certain documents, claims national security. This one's been sealed since, looks like 1870. Luke didn't need to read it to know what it probably contained. Details about the Fort Smith program, information about other enhanced subjects, evidence that the government wanted buried. His trial had been public, but the full truth had been quietly classified. "Can I get a copy of the regular transcript?" he asked. "You a lawyer or a relative?" Luke smiled. Both, in a way. He left Little Rock with the transcript in his bag and a deeper understanding of what had happened. His trial had been theater, a public display of justice that had satisfied immediate demands while the real story was being sealed away in classified files. Judge Hayes had freed him, yes, but only because doing so was politically useful at that moment. The government had never really acknowledged what they'd done, never truly accepted responsibility. It was something, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Luke returned to Alaska and to his family. He watched his daughters grow up and have children of their own. He worked and lived and tried to find peace in the life he'd built. But he never forgot what had been done to him and others like him. And he never stopped wondering how many other subjects were out there, living under assumed names, carrying the same burden of enhancement and exploitation. In 1912, when Luke was 80 years old by his best estimate, Sarah died. She'd been sick for months, her body simply wearing out the way bodies do. Luke held her hand as she slipped away, and for the first time since Thanksgiving night 1867, he cried. After her funeral, one of his daughters found him sitting alone, staring at the scars on his palms. "Are you all right, Papa?" "Just remembering," Luke said. "Your mother was the only person who ever really saw me as just a man. Not as Subject L7, not as the Bone Breaker, not as an enhanced subject or an escaped specimen, just as Luke, just as me." "We see you that way," his daughter said. "All of us do." Luke nodded, but he knew it wasn't quite true. His children loved him, but they also knew he was different. They'd seen him do things normal people couldn't do. They'd grown up with a father who never seemed to age, who could work longer and harder than men half his age, who sometimes woke screaming from nightmares about needles and pain and voices telling him he was property, not a person. They loved him despite his differences, which wasn't the same as loving him without seeing them. Luke lived another 7 years, finally dying in his sleep in 1919 at the age of 87. His funeral was well attended. He'd become a respected member of his community over 5 decades in Alaska. People spoke warmly of his strength, his work ethic, his dedication to family. None of them mentioned Blackwood or Little Rock, or the Bone Breaker legend. His daughters had agreed not to share that part of his history. They buried him with the name he'd used in Alaska, not the one from his past. They thought they were protecting him, preserving the life he'd built far from the violence and exploitation of his youth. But one of his granddaughters knew better. She'd heard the stories. Her grandfather had told her one night when she couldn't sleep, had shared the truth about who he'd been and what he'd done. She was 12 at the time, old enough to understand but young enough to be awed rather than frightened. "Why are you telling me this?" she'd asked. "Because someone needs to remember," Luke had replied. "Not the legend, not the mythology, the truth. What they did to me and others like me, why I did what I did, what it cost, and why it was necessary. Someone needs to carry that story forward, make sure it doesn't get completely erased." "But you said the government classified everything." "They classified the official records. They can't classify memory. They can't seal away the stories people tell, the truths that get passed down. That's your job now. To remember, to tell the story when it matters." And she did. Decades later, when government files from the Reconstruction era began to be declassified, when researchers started piecing together the history of illegal human experimentation programs, she came forward. She shared what her grandfather had told her, provided the trial transcript Luke had obtained in 1893, connected the story of Subject L7 to the legend of the Bone Breaker of Little Rock. It took time, years of research, verification, documentation. But eventually the truth emerged. The Fort Smith program had existed. Enhanced subjects had been created and exploited. Luke had killed his oppressor and walked free, not because the system worked, but because one judge had been brave enough to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. The story spread slowly at first, then faster. Historians wrote about it. Journalists investigated. Descendants of other enhanced subjects came forward with their own stories, their own evidence of government wrongdoing. A picture emerged of a program that had operated in shadows, that had treated human beings as experimental materials, that had created people like Luke, and then tried to erase all evidence of their existence. Public opinion was divided, as it always is with difficult history. Some saw Luke as a murderer who'd escaped justice through legal technicalities. Others saw him as a victim who'd fought back against impossible oppression. Still others focused on the government's role, demanding accountability for experiments that had violated every ethical principle. But everyone agreed on one thing. The story needed to be told. The truth needed to be preserved. Because hidden history has a way of repeating itself, and the only defense against that is remembering. The carriage house where Luke killed Nathaniel Blackwood is long gone. The Blackwood estate exists only in property records and old photographs. The trial transcript sits in archives, available to researchers but rarely requested. And Luke himself rests in an Alaskan cemetery under a name that connects him to his life, not his legend. But the story endures. The bone breaker of Little Rock, not the mythological giant of tavern tales, but the real man who was born into slavery, transformed by illegal experiments, exploited by men who saw him as property, and who finally said no at a cost he knew would be devastating. Was it murder? Legally, the question was settled in 1868. Morally, it remains complex. Luke took a life. That's an undeniable fact. But he did so in defense of his own humanity, in rejection of a system that denied his personhood, in a moment when every other option had been exhausted. Judge Hayes understood this when he set Luke free. Theodore Winthrop understood it when he built Luke's defense. Sarah understood it when she risked everything to help him, and Luke's granddaughter understood it when she chose to share his story with the world. Some acts can't be justified in absolute terms. They can only be understood in context, judged against the alternatives, measured by their necessity rather than their righteousness. Breaking bones, whether literal or metaphorical, is sometimes the only way to break free. That's what Thanksgiving night 1867 was really about. Not violence for its own sake, but a man reaching the absolute limit of what he could endure, and choosing, in that moment, to be human on his own terms, rather than property on someone else's. The government tried to bury this story. They sealed files, classified documents, discouraged inquiry. They wanted enhanced subjects to disappear into history, to become rumors and legends rather than documented facts. They wanted people to forget that such experiments had been conducted, that such exploitation had occurred. But they failed. Because Luke refused to disappear completely. Because Sarah made sure the evidence survived. Because one judge chose principle over precedent. Because a granddaughter honored her grandfather's request to remember and tell. And because ultimately, the truth has a weight to it that even classified files and sealed records can't suppress forever. So now you know the real story of Luke, the bone breaker of Little Rock. Not a monster or a superhuman or a legend, but a man who was made into something he never asked to be, who survived what should have killed him, who fought back when fighting back was the only option left. They say his hands could bend iron and crush stone. That part's true. But the real strength wasn't in his muscles. It was in his refusal to accept what he was told he had to be, in his insistence on being recognized as human, regardless of the cost, in his willingness to break things, including himself, rather than submit to one more day of exploitation. That kind of strength doesn't come from chemical enhancement or experimental protocols. It comes from somewhere deeper, from the part of the human spirit that simply will not break, no matter how much pressure is applied. That's the legacy of the Bone Breaker. That's the story that needed to be told. And if you're wondering whether there are still secrets buried in government archives, still classified files about human enhancement experiments, still subjects living under assumed names in quiet corners of the world, well, that's a question worth asking. Because as Luke learned, the only way to keep history from repeating is to remember it fully, to drag uncomfortable truths into the light, to refuse to let the powerful bury what they'd rather forget. Some things need breaking. Sometimes the only way out is through, and sometimes the Bone Breaker is the only one honest enough to name what needs breaking. Remember that. Pass it forward. Don't let them bury this again. That's what Luke would have wanted. That's why his granddaughter shared his story. That's why you're reading this now. The experiment is over, but its effects endure. In descendants carrying genetic markers of enhancement, in documents that continue to be declassified, in stories that refuse to stay buried, in the uncomfortable questions that demand uncomfortable answers. Was Luke a hero or a murderer? A victim or a killer? An enhanced subject or a human being? The answer, of course, is yes. All of these. Because real history doesn't fit neat categories. Real people contain contradictions. And real justice sometimes looks nothing like what we expect. So tell this story. Share it. Keep it alive. Because somewhere in those archives, there are other stories waiting to be told. Other subjects waiting to be acknowledged. Other truths demanding recognition. And maybe, just maybe, remembering what happened to Luke will help prevent it from happening again.